Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning, good evening, whenever you're viewing this. And once again, it's time for the second in our series of Father Tim Talks. Today's topic is called Is It a Sin? Well, one may wonder why this topic. Well, I frequently have been asked in my experience of confession, Father, is X a sin? Or students in my teaching career would often say, Father, is such and such a sin? My response to that, it depends. Let's so then take a look a little bit at what sin entails and a little bit then about grace and what we might learn from. First of all, we want to take a look at sin in the scriptures, both in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and in the Christian. Starting off with the sin in the Old Testament, there are three words that are generally used to describe sin in the Old Testament. The first one is hata. And hata means literally missing the mark. So we're aiming at something and we kind of fall short of that. Secondly, the word that's used is awan. It can mean guilt or the twisted inner state of the sinner. When we feel guilt, when we've done something wrong, when we've hurt someone, awan kind of describes that guilt that we feel in having done something wrong. Pesa is another word that's used. It means rebellion before God. And we have a number of examples of Pesa in the Old Testament. This is one of them that's kind of exemplified that we all might be able to remember. When Moses was up on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments, the people down were rebelling against God and they built a golden calf, which was kind of their rebellion against God. And it's interesting to note that in terms of our discussion of sin, that this was prior to the people accepting the Ten Commandments. So they really didn't have the law of God spelled out for them. But this was something that arose from within them. They turned away from God, and that, in essence, is what sin is all about. We look at sin in the New Testament then. Again, three words that are often used: parapatoma, which means a misstep or a lapse from the truth; parabasis, which means a transgression or violation of the law. And here's where we get that idea about a sin is against the law of God. And then lastly, kind of cut off there, the hamartia, from kind of related to the word hata, which means missing the mark. And here we have kind of a picture here of someone who's very bad at target practice, but these arrows are missing the mark. And that's kind of a good way to look at sin when we see that we're aiming for something and then we kind of miss that mark that we're aiming for. Some common ideas that appear in the scriptural references here. First is that sin is some sort of a transgression against the divine command and or the covenantal relationship with God. Remember that picture a few slides ago about the golden calf? That was a transgression against the covenant of God. I will be your God and you will be my people. This was prior to kind of any of the idea of the commands that we see in the Ten Commandments. Second is both in the Hebrew scripture and the Christian scripture, we see that sin is kind of looking at missing the mark or falling short of what God intends for us or what we try to aim for in our relationship with God. Sometimes we fall short of that. And finally, rebellion. That's frequently used in the Old Testament in particular by the prophets as the people not living up to their covenant or relationship. And that's why all the bad things were happening to them. In the Gospels, then, we find that Jesus forgives sins. We have numerous examples of that in the Christian scriptures. And then Jesus at Pentecost gives the apostles the power to forgive sins in his name. From John 20:23, he says, whose sins you forgive are forgiven, and whose sins you retain, they are retained. So he's giving the apostles that same power from God that Jesus had to act in his name for the apostles to forgive sins. In the later Gospels, and as the Christian community develops, we have a question that arises and that will be continued to be talked about throughout the early church is what sins could the church forgive? Well, in Matthew and Luke, you see there Matthew 12:31, Luke 12:10. The one sin that the church could not forgive was the sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, which kind of makes sense if we're blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, denying that. That's the power of God at work in our midst. So if we are going against that, that it could be easily to see how that sin could not be forgiven. But other sins could be forgiven, and this will start us on an interesting journey about how sins are forgiven in the church. So we want to take a look now a little bit at the development of the ideas on sin, particularly in the early church, and then how they kind of take us into modern times. In the early church, the question kept coming up about what sins could be forgiven by the church, particularly as the church was under persecution and people would go to other religions, they would practice idolatry. That really hurt the community, and they really had to stick together during that time. And so there's a question, could these people be forgiven? Well, a couple of church fathers, Tertullian and Ambrose, who lived in the second and third centuries, they maintained that these sins could be forgiven only once, and that can be a rough time for us. But they were looking, at the way that this damaged not only relationship with God, but within the community, that it took away from the unity of the early community. And so they maintained that these sins could be forgiven only once. So one time, that's all you had. There was some degree of distinction in degrees of sinfulness. As the church kind of kept reflecting, they saw that not all sin would as damage that relationship with God and other people in the same way. So we have degrees of sinfulness. Not all sins are as serious as others in nature. Okay, the serious sins then, those that were, like the word says, serious, that damage the relationship with God and the other community. These sins then later required public penance, because the idea behind that was that in these early times, the sin of one person, particularly if they would go to idolatry, would result in a damage to the rest of the community. And so in this public penance then, it was known as the Order of Penitents, where these folks would pray outside of the cathedral. They were not allowed in church. And what they did is they stood outside the church and they asked for the people to pray for them. So it was, again, a way of trying to bring about the prayer of the community to reconcile the sinner to the community. And here we have a little drawing here that's on the steps of the church, and you see off to the right there, these would have been those in the Order of Penitents, begging for forgiveness and being reconciled to the church. Again, this was for serious sins. And these were, we'll see, were then kind of determined to be what we call mortal sins. We didn't quite have that distinction until a little bit later in the church. So we've got the way of forgiveness, and it incorporated the prayer of the community to help reconcile these, because they saw that sin had affected the community as well. This was, again, like I say, the beginning of what we currently call mortal sin. What is a sin then? In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1849, this is a quote. It says, "Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. It wounds the nature of man," and I added, "and woman, and injures human solidarity. It has been defined as an utterance, a deed, or a desire contrary to the eternal law or the law of God." So in this definition, again, we see that there's a genuine failure in love of God, and it has that communal dimension as well, against love of neighbor, and a perverse attachment to certain goods, which would take us away from the good, which is God. And it injures human solidarity, that there are effects that it causes in the human community. As I mentioned a little while ago, that we have developed degrees and types of sin. As I my little thermometer there, we have different degrees of sin. First, we have original sin. This is not a sin in the strict sense of the word, since there's no, as we will see, culpability or responsibility. But original sin was kind of developed, and this was Augustine did a lot of thinking on this. Original sin was seen as the capacity to do wrong that was inherent in all human beings. Just by the fact that we're human, we have this propensity toward doing wrong or sin. I used to say when I lived in Northwest Indiana, where all the steel mills and a lot of industrial pollutions were dumped out into the atmosphere. It's getting better now. But I used to say, no one could live in that region and not be affected by those pollutants. And that's somewhat the idea about what we kind of have named as original sin. Sin in our origin, the origin in our human person to do wrong. Then we have actual sin. These are ones that we are culpable, we have blame for, or that we are responsible, that we made the decision to do X. Okay? Mortal sin are deadly. It severs the relationship with God. It's so severe. So it's a big sin. Okay, it's deadly. And then less than deadly, there are serious sins that we have. And serious is not deadly, but it really injures the relationship with God. And then venial sin are the less serious sins, okay? And they can be determined by a couple of conditions that we'll see here in a moment. So we've got the actual sin that we are responsible for, or we have blame for, because we made the decision to choose to do that particular action. Mortal, serious, and venial. And then something that theologians have been talking about in recent years is what they call social sins. And these aren't necessarily, sin in the strict sense, but rather by analogy, where they talk about sinful systems, that evil has been so pervasive, it just kind of gets incorporated into the systems of our society. And we'll take a look a little bit at each of these coming up. Original sin, we see here the sin that was brought on by the first humans. We see there Adam and Eve being tempted there and eating from the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The first humans, okay? So this was then a turning to self rather than to God. If you eat of this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God, okay? They would turn to self. They wanted to be like God rather than just being human. And this propensity is universal. As soon as we used to say, that a child can sin when they reach the age of reason, when they know that something is wrong and that they are responsible. This propensity for sin is universal. And we see that not all religions will call it a sin, but there is something in almost all world religions about the propensity for humans to bring about evil in which they are responsible for. And in a sense, it's original sin is like we cannot not be affected by evil. Yes, I've used two negatives there for emphasis. And it's sort of like the example I just talked about when people who would live up in Northwest Indiana, what we call the region, with all the steel mills, the oil refineries spewing out all these things, they could not be affected by that. Mortal sin, then, taking a look at the different types of sin. Mortal sin was used first by Tertullian, we met him a little earlier, in the late 2nd century. Tertullian, as we saw, thought that the church should refuse to forgive these deadly sins. Mortal coming from the Latin mortalia, meaning deadly. And he defined these, for example, as idolatry, blasphemy, murder, fornication, etc. Tertullian maintained that these should not be forgiven. They should refuse to forgive these sins because they were deadly. Secondly, the church didn't really fully accept this, but later these sins were subjected to the idea of public penance that we saw earlier in this presentation. Mortal sin then completely severs a relationship with God. We see this little graphic here. There's a chasm there that there's no way that an individual could cross between that chasm between God. That sin brings about death, and that is, when we willingly choose to sever that relationship with God. Mortal sin requires what our tradition says grave matter, or an offense against the eternal law. It has to be something really serious to cut off that relationship with God. The conditions for mortal sin is both listed in the Catechism and throughout the history of the Church. We have to have three conditions. There has to be sufficient reflection, and we have to think about and realize that this is a serious matter and that we are consenting to do this. It doesn't just happen on the fly. Secondly, it has to be full consent of the will. We have to be able to freely and fully consent to do that act so that we have responsibility, saying that, yes, I did this. There can be a lot of things that interfere with that full consent. If we're forced into something, like if someone puts a gun at the back of your head, in your back and says you're going to go rob this bank, obviously there's not a full consent of the will. You're being forced into that. And thirdly, there has to be serious matter, and that's determined, again, this is coming from the Catechism in 1857 to 9, and these are the paragraphs in the Catechism. So these are the three conditions that are necessary for mortal sin. So the matter or the action has to be serious, and the person must give full and free consent and think about that. Okay, so those are three conditions that have to be necessary for one to have mortal sin. Serious sin, on the other hand, represents a grave or serious wrong, but something is lacking in there, whether it's like full consent of the will or there's something going on where we're not giving free and full consent, or we didn't have sufficient reflection. Serious sin does not necessarily sever the relationship with God, but it harms it. And we know that in relationships with people, we kind of have the same thing, that sometimes we can do something that will sever a relationship with one, but it doesn't always do that. It can harm the relationship, but not always break it. Okay. Venial sin, then, they are lesser sins, and venial sin is acting inconsistently to be committed for life and love. It's less serious. These are the kind of the lesser sins, okay? Lesser degrees of sinfulness. So, in order to sin, we must know it's wrong and fully consent to do it. Even the venial sin, we have to give consent to that. Because for sin, it is I am responsible. I am blamable because I chose to do that. So forgetting is not a sin. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard in confession, I forgot my morning prayers. That's not a sin because you did not choose to do that. If you're going to pray the prayers and you say, oh, I'm not saying it, that's a different matter, but forgetting is not a sin because you do not fully consent to that particular action. Okay? If we are not totally free, then responsibility is lessened for that. The degree of sinfulness then goes down. This is a little graphic I found on the internet looking at the state of grace where we're totally within God, and that could be closer to the border there. Venial sin is we still are in a relationship with God, but that relationship with damage. Then mortal sin, deadly sin, is the one where we have severed that relationship with God. A remedy for sin. Okay? Individual confession as we know it began with the Irish monks in about the 4th to 6th century. Initially, it started as kind of a spiritual direction, ways that people sought to be holy. And then kind of their faults, their sinfulness kind of became grounded in that. Confession, then, this practice, as we get into the later Middle Ages, this practice becomes more legalistic, and for some in this day and age, that tendency still continues. So confession that sin, focused on breaking the law of God. And so God was looked at as more the judge. And the idea was then to balance the sin with the appropriate penance. And these days, we see God as more merciful. Not God is a judge, but we're more focused on the idea of God's mercy. Since there was no seminary training at that time, there were what we call penitentials or handbooks to help priests give the appropriate penance to balance that infraction of the sin with the appropriate penance. This was an example here of just one line from a penitential handbook around the 6th century. And this is an actual quote from one. He says, if any cleric or woman, I thought it was interesting that there was no mention of a man there, but if any cleric or woman who practices magic misleads anyone by the magic, it is a monstrous sin, but a sin that can be expiated by penance. Such an offender shall do penance for 6 years, 3 years on allowance of bread and water, and during the remaining years he shall abstain from meat and wine. If, however, a person does not mislead anyone, but gives a potion for the sake of wanton love to someone, he shall do penance for an entire year on an allowance of bread and water. You can see they didn't mess around with this. And you can also see, some degree of sinfulness. The second example is less of a penance. They allowed then some prayers to substitute for these years of penance. But you can see it was, they didn't mess around. And they would go through all kinds of different sins with the appropriate penance. So there'd be some kind of equality there in the sense of the judgment that the priest would make on what needs to be repaired. And this focuses on that idea of God as the social sin, like I said, is kind of a sin by analogy. This is a quote that I found from Archbishop Oscar Romero. He was assassinated down in Central America about 1980. He said, social sin is the crystallization of individual sin into permanent structures that keep sin in being and makes its force to be felt by the majority of the people. Okay, again, it's we don't necessarily have culpability, but the sin is just kind of integrated within the systems of society. Social sin then really is kind of sin by analogy, and that we may not be fully culpable or have full blame for that. Examples of social sin is we see, that even today, women make less money than men for doing the same job. It's just in the system there. Funding for schools, recently here, we see the systematic racism, sexism, that's just a part of our system. The example using there about funding for schools, again, there was a real clear example when I was up in Northwest Indiana. The city of Gary, that city is just really struggling. The steel industries are out, and so the school systems there, because schools are funded by property taxes, they don't have a whole lot of money. About 10 miles away in a little suburb called Maryville, they've got all kinds of things going down there. And you go by one of the interstates I used to drive by frequently, and the high school in Maryville, they had a huge stadium. It was a beautiful school at large. But not more than 10 miles away, go by Gary, that school it was crumbling down. The funding there, not the equipment. So it's just in the system there, the kids from Gary didn't have the same opportunities, educational opportunities as the kids from Mary. Guilt, we know by sin. Guilt can be healthy. We know that we have messed up and that we are responsible. Guilt can be unhealthy when it is excessive and overtakes, when we just keep going over and over again and trying to take more responsibility than what we have. So guilt can be helpful, but it can be excessive, and then it becomes unhealthy. As a remedy for sin, we have God's grace, God's life that's shared with us to overcome sin and temptation. Grace helps us to turn from sin to God and others, again, from going out of self to another that gets us away from it. Grace then changes everything. And I think that's something that we kind of need to focus on and be aware of in our own lives, that grace of God that's with us always and that can help us overcome sin. I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope you continue to watch my little presentations. I hope to do these about every 2 weeks, and so we'll see you the next time. Thank you for stopping by.